Welcome to the 2021 Mick Dark Talk for the Future. I'm Vici Stewart, Executive Director of Varuna, the National Writers' House, and I'll be your MC this evening. And it is so fabulous to see you all here. Our first live event in over a year. And what a year it was. And welcome to everybody who's tuning in from all around Australia on our first ever live stream. Each year, the Mick Dark Talk honours the legacy of Mick Dark, who gifted the House of Varuna to the Writers of Australia in 1989. Mick Dark was a deeply committed environmentalist, a past president of Blue Mountains Conservation Society, known as CONSOC. And thank you, CONSOC. I'd just like to say thank you for all the amazing work you do for our precious and fragile Blue Mountains environment, and for partnering with us on this event. We remain grateful for Mick Dark's generosity and to his family and to his wife, Jill Dark, who's here tonight, and his son, Rod. Today, Varuna exists to support the development of new writing from emerging and established writers. And look, it's a huge remit and one we take very seriously. Each year we welcome about 200 writers to Varuna, and we facilitate a pretty busy program of community workshops and professional development. We also run the annual Blue Mountains Writers Festival, which will be held again this year in October, COVID willing, in this spot in the Carrington from the 21st to the 24th of October. So save the date and hope to see you here. I'd also like to thank our funding bodies, Create New South Wales and the Australia Council, for helping us to deliver these programs. Varuna extends a warm welcome tonight to our Chair, Jennifer Scott, and Councillor Brent Hoare, our Ward 2 Councillor. I'd also like to acknowledge that this event is being held on the land of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, and to acknowledge our elders past and present. On that note, please welcome Chris Tobin, Darug man, artist and educator, to the stage.
Thank you, Vici. Buju Waragal, everyone. Good evening and Nalawa. Welcome. I'm one of the Darug people, actually. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the Darug and the Gundungurra country. As a Darug man and traditional custodian, I feel quite strongly the role that we all share, which is as custodians of this country. For us, it's our ancestral responsibility to look after the place. And I get to do that in lots of forms, one being invited to come and welcome you, which I think is such an encouraging development in our nation, that we have this developing this respect for Aboriginal people. There's a lot we can learn from our culture and our ancient culture that we have here. I have the beautiful job, actually, ordinarily going into schools to share a bit of that culture. It's happening already in the schools there, because I think for a future, what we do need is a cultural shift and cultural change. I get the beautiful job of sharing with people, with young people often, how we normally live. They respond to it. They're getting the same messages at school. They're being taught to share. They're being taught to be fair. They're being taught to be thoughtful and look after the environment. Now, I don't know what happens when they leave primary school, but sadly, probably the aims of the world impinge on them. And somewhere along the line, someone's told them that they're here to accumulate stuff. Our beautiful ancestors and the way they lived is able to challenge that for them, and which is why I love going in there and doing that. I'm going to share that with you too. A lot of people actually don't know much about our traditional Aboriginal culture, and Aboriginal people today, that's where we draw our values from. Now, I'm pleased to report that as human beings, we do pretty well on the planet. I love that Captain Cook arrived here a mere 250 years ago, stepped out in the boat, saw the country and assumed the people there had only just arrived themselves. We now know they were living there for about 20 to 30,000 years, kept the rivers clean, kept each other looked after. And I mean kept each other looked after. I've got to be careful, I'll break into a cultural talk here, but people need to know that we are normally not a competitive people. We don't When we traded with each other, it wasn't to better ourselves. It wasn't to accumulate more. It wasn't to profit from the other person. It was to keep the other people happy. Captain Cook described the people he met, even though they were naked, walking around with just tools they fashioned from the bush, as one of the happiest people he'd ever met. He wrote to his friend in England, "We that all we have are nowhere near as happy as these savages in New South Wales." Now, I don't have enough time to take on that savage one, all right? But I'll just say we weren't the one doing slaves and drawing, quartering and all that kind of stuff and whipping people. Wasn't a perfect culture, but there is so much we can learn from our ancestors. And one is to look after each other. And I think if we felt looked after, if we looked after our old people, if we looked after our sick people better, I don't think people are going to be needing to stack up and take from the future of our kids to make themselves feel secure. And they don't have to have military might over everyone. We had a very beautiful system we'd share with the rest of the world. Instead of arming up against people we weren't sure about, we would marry into them. You muck around with them just as much, but without the bloodshed. So again, a lot we can learn from our ancestors. But I won't take up too much time. We're here to hear some very inspiring talks. I will share, though, that I do see a future for us. Now, I know these are dire times. So I go down to Parramatta quite frequently, and again, the development there, and I work for national parks. It's hard to do now with an organisation that's now the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Good Lord. However, we will get through this. I don't bother with the courts. I see the next generation coming up. I'm not going to put it on them to have to do, but I can see a shift and a change in those values. I'll remind you again, Captain Cook, happiest people he'd ever met. And that's what we want for everyone, really. But we have a responsibility. In our idea of country, when we welcome people to country, when we talk about country, the Aboriginal concept extends from the rocks and the trees to all the other brother and sister creatures that share the country with us. But it also extends to the ancestors who have lived here before us. When we make decisions for country, we need to consider the ancestors, the old people that came before us, and the descendants that are coming after us. We can't be eaten away and not thinking about them. So again, I see great shifts in my lifetime. The way we treat animals, the way we treat each other is changing and improving. So let's just get over the line while we still have a planet. But again, I will point to so many beautiful things today that do that. And one is inviting me up to welcome you to country. It's a humbling and a very beautiful thing we do in the country in Australia. So thank you again, Jijigora, and have a beautiful night. Yano.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's always splendid and so inspiring to speak after you. And I would like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners while you've just done that from my perspective. I'm Tara Cameron. I am the president of the Blue Mountains Conservation Society. And I'd just like to begin by thanking Vici for that introduction about Mick, because we see tonight as that bringing together of the writing that Mick acknowledged, and through Varuna, the writers that we have in the Blue Mountains, and also work to protect the Blue Mountains that we do in the Conservation Society. Now, the Conservation Society has about over 900 members, and we have lots of different campaigns. And some of these are things like trying to stop a croc park from being developed on Boddington Hill and some kind of crazy stuff like that. But when it comes to climate change and sustainability, that is a key part of our work. But it's also one in which we can feel, and I'm speaking here both from my own perspective, from the Conservation Society's perspective, and as a parent, an area that you can feel extremely overwhelmed. I have recently had a child wake up in the middle of the night, reading David Attenborough's book and saying, all the animals are going to be extinct. What am I going to be doing? So I am incredibly happy that tonight we have the opportunity to hear from a great panel and to have writers that can help us put something that's really difficult to talk about into some words, because through words and being able to explain complicated things, that helps us become empowered. And so often when we talk about climate change, I don't have the words. So I would really like to thank our panelists, and it's so great to be part of an evening that helps us get some words and helps that writing make us more empowered, inspires us, gives us some hope. And so thank you for coming along tonight. Thanks for partnering with us, Varuna. We hope we have a fantastic evening, and together we will go on with climate change in a really positive way to bring that hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Tara. I'd now like to welcome Bianca Nogrady to the stage, science journalist, broadcaster and author, and also director on the Varuna board. Bianca's going to be the facilitator of the panel tonight, and welcome, Bianca.
I might actually invite the rest of the panel to come up and join us. Tim's looking at the back there. And I believe we're going to hopefully get Ketan up and running. So thank you, Vici. Oh, there's Ketan, excellent. Thank you, Tara, and thank you for welcoming us to Darug and Gundungurra country, Chris. I'd also like to pay my respects to Darug and Gundungurra elders, past and present, and to any First Nations people here today or watching. Given the subject matter of this discussion, I'd also like to acknowledge the care and respect with which Australia's First Nations people have lived on and looked after this country for more than 100,000 years. And we sometimes forget that the Anthropocene is something that has began with European colonisation. So the topic for tonight is hope and change. And I'm really glad that we have this second word in there, change, because hope itself is useless. It may comfort us, it may inspire us, but it can also lull us, it can soothe us, and it can even disempower us. We have to hope because the alternative is to be hopeless. And we also have to change because the status quo is deadly. It's deadly to the environment and it's deadly to us as an integral part of that environment. So this is the perfect group of people to talk about hope and change because they each bring a sense of hope that we can change and offer ways in which we can achieve that change. So I'll introduce our three panellists tonight. So Rebecca Huntley is a social researcher and former director of the Mind and Mood Report, which is a long-running measure of Australians' attitudes and trends, which would be very interesting to see what's going on in that in the last year. She's also a member of Al Gore's Climate Reality Corps, and she's author of How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, which all the books will be available afterwards, and our two authors who are here in real life will be joining for signing. Ketan Joshi, who is joining us from Oslo, which is amazing, is a climate and clean tech author, journalist and analyst. And I love his Twitter bio because it declares we are cancelling the apocalypse. So yes, I think that's incredibly hopeful. We'll go with that. And he is author of Windfall, Unlocking a Fossil-Free Future. And last but most certainly not least, Tim Flannery is a scientist, explorer, conservationist and writer. He's currently Chief Counsellor of the Climate Council, but his list of academic positions and achievements is so long that I think we would run out of time before we ran out of titles. So we're going to shorten that, and suffice it to say he really knows what he's talking about. He is most recently author of The Climate Cure, Solving the Climate Emergency in the Era of COVID-19. So if you could please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel. Now, seeing as we've started off very much talking about emotions and hope and change, I'm going to start with you, Rebecca, and ask, you know, hope and change, but hope is a mixed blessing, and you write about emotions a lot in your book. How do we remain hopeful, but not so hopeful that we surrender to wishful thinking?
Well, the only kind of really useful hope is hope through action. So just sitting with your keeper cup in your lounge room is not really the best solution to hope. And I think that hope is also other people, which is kind of the opposite. I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre said, hell is other people, but he was like not fun to hang out with. And I think he had a very gloomy approach to things. But I think that for me, a spark for both action and the need to step up, and certainly in terms of my generation on climate, and an enormous sense of hope was watching young people around the world kind of put their iPads down and effectively show how concerned and anxious they are. Some of those young people are doing quite innovative and creative things, whether that be taking fossil fuel companies to court or taking governments to court, lobbying insurance companies, lobbying investors. And so in that generation, there's an enormous amount of hope. They are probably the ones that should be the least hopeful, because even the most sober, even Tim's most sober, and he doesn't have very sober kind of projections about what's going to happen with climate change, we know that they are going to be affected more than anybody else. Only 1% of young Australians under 25 are climate deniers, compared to 9% of the rest of the population. So that means that we're letting them down. But they're enormously hopeful, and they haven't given up. So it's really, I can't give up. I have to be hopeful. I have a moral obligation to be hopeful, as long as I remain hopeful.
It's interesting because you talk about in your book about the school strikes, and that was a real moment for you that not necessarily tipped you into action, but it tipped you into something.
It did in kind of 5 minutes. I mean, I'm the mother of 3 children. I've got twins that are 6, and I'm used to children asking me to do stuff. But it's normally, can I have a jar of Nutella for dinner? Or can I have like 5,000 iPads? But this really felt like, and I'm not alone in this in my generation, this really felt like a genuine call to action for a generation that actually has power, that actually has some kind of leverage. And, it's a pretty cruel trick to say to a generation like that, we really want you to work really hard at school. We really need you to brush your teeth and do all these kinds of things to get them to work hard, often incredibly hard, for a future that may not, that is extraordinarily insecure. Insecure not just environmentally but socially, and everything that flows from that, which is why you have in the focus groups that I just did a couple of weeks ago with young Australians, young people under 25, saying it's really up for grabs about whether I'll have children. And that's not, I'm not saying that they're not going to, but they're genuinely questioning whether bringing children into the world is worth it. So again, a moral and ethical responsibility to support them, because that kind of level of anxiety and despair shouldn't, 22-year-old men and women in Australia should not be facing that level of anxiety and despair.
I guess it's deeply unfair. And Ketan, one thing in your book, one of my favourite lines, and there were quite a few of them, is you said we can cancel the apocalypse with the snowballing power of fairness, science, and fury. Tell me about fairness. Why fairness in there?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry that I'm so far away. It would be really wonderful to be there with you. Fairness comes up a lot, not just in climate impacts, but in climate solutions. This is sort of what I work on. And when it comes to the way technologies are deployed, the way regulations are created, sometimes they're not deployed in a way that looks at the ways that societies are already unfair. So one specific example could be, I live in Norway. It's full of electric vehicles, right? Like there's just so many EVs. You walk out onto the street here in Oslo and you're just guaranteed to see one. And part of the reason that has been so successful is not because, Norway's a rich country and people can afford Teslas. That is kind of true. There's a lot of oil money where I live. But it was also because the incentives for EVs were designed in such a way that would allow small, cheap EVs to be available to people on much lower incomes as well, right? So that was also paired with this large project to make bike lanes more accessible here in Oslo, and improve the walkability of cities, and also get rid of cars. There are actually parts of Oslo, central Oslo, that have banned cars now. And that's just going to keep expanding. So this is actually a really good example of where it's not just about the technology. It's actually trying to take into account pre-existing unfairness in society. And what happens when you do that is that people recognize that climate action, if it's designed right, can actually be really enriching and helpful. And we live in this time where we're undergoing this barrage of things that just keep going wrong. It feels like every day there's just this new thing about something else that kind of really hurts us and makes us feel a bit crappy. And it just making climate action something that really focuses on focuses on inequality can be a really, really good and powerful thing. Like not just from a pure moral perspective, because it's good to be fair, but also that it probably makes decarbonization faster and it makes it more resilient as well.
Yeah. One thing you also talk about is this idea of the democratization of energy, that, you know, with this shift away from these kind of monolithic corporate ownership to models that are community participation, of benefit, of engagement. Can you give some examples, I guess, of where this has been done well in the world, where I guess it does embody this notion of fairness?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to refer to Europe again. Sorry to be the turtleneck-wearing European guy in this one. It's you know, Denmark has the highest share of wind power of any country in the world at the moment, and a huge part of that is because the way it was developed is it was actually mandatory for wind farm developers to offer shares to people living nearby. And, you know, a lot of these wind farms were being built in areas where there were, you know, lots of issues around farming, and other streams of revenue were declining. So getting people actively involved in that sort of development resulted in a very, you know, empirical, real, measurable decrease in emissions. You know, this really made a difference. Germany is the other place in the world that has had a really good community ownership system for its renewable energy growth. Unfortunately, in the past like half decade or so, it hasn't been quite as good. And also, unfortunately, we're seeing that reflected in a slowdown in the growth of onshore wind power in Germany, due to people basically looking at these projects and saying, well, I'm not really getting much from this. So why would I sort of tolerate the impacts? And, you know, renewable energy does have some impacts, of course. It's a huge machine often in natural environments. So you really just have to get people involved. And, you know, the other example of somewhere where this is actually going pretty well is in Australia. There are a few projects like the Sapphire Wind Farm or the Hepburn Wind Farm in Victoria that have really successfully implemented these models. So I think this is actually I dedicate half the book to this. You know, this is a super important part of making sure climate action goes as fast as we can. Yeah.
So Tim, you write that, and I guess this is probably a fairly well-known fact, that we essentially need to cut emissions globally by at least, I think it's 8% per year for the next decade if we have any hope at all of reining in global warming. But you also note that the real battle to achieve this is in the boardrooms of fossil fuel industries. You know, for all of this talk about community participation and individuals, how is that battle going in Australia and globally right now?
Look, I'd say that in Australia, it's not going as well as it should. Globally, there are some really interesting things happening. And let's look at Australia first. So about a week ago, Santos, you know, the big gas company, announced that they were going to develop a huge gas field to the north of Darwin in the ocean. And their share price plunged by $4.5 billion, apparently, the total cost.
Wow.
Yeah, just money went out of the company because people didn't want to see that, you know.
Got some cheers from the audience there.
They're slow learners in Australia, right? But look at, say, one of the kind of middle rank petroleum companies, Occidental Petroleum from the US. They have just reimagined what that company's about. It used to be about fossil fuel extraction. They now call themselves a carbon management company, and they are buying into carbon capture and storage, you know, and direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere, because they can see a market in future for managing carbon. They know we're going to have to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they see their future there. So companies like that, I mean, if we take them at face value, they're doing some really significant things. Among the majors, I think that it was Royal Dutch Shell has said they want to be basically at carbon neutral, you know, by 2050. So things are happening. I guess what is still the big problem, though, is that people are looking at that quarterly profit or loss report, reporting back to the shareholders and acting short term. So how we change that is a big issue.
And you and Ketan both write about Germany's, I'm going to mispronounce this, energy vendor, the energy turning, and this idea of a coal compromise. Yeah. I mean, are we seeing, what is that? And are we starting to see that now in Australia?
No, we're not. You know, you have a look at the election. There's a by-election going on up in the Hunter Valley at the moment, right? Everyone is trying to pitch it. The Labor Party's picked an ex-coal guy to stand. You know, the Nationals have got a coal guy. the truth of the matter is no one can save Australian coal jobs in the long term. You go up to the Huntley, you see the number of jobs that have been lost just through companies getting more efficient and shedding labour and employing machines, buying machines to do the work. There's already significant hardship in those coal communities. And what we need to be saying to those people, I think, is to say, look, we fellow Australians will stand with you. We understand this is going to be difficult, but if you look at Germany and see what's happened there, you see that all Germans are standing together on this and not a single job will be lost in those coal communities. You think about the number of person hours put into bulldozing those holes in the ground up in the Hunter Valley. There's going to be just as many person hours devoted to filling them back in. Yeah, with mine site remediation. We need to make sure that the companies are committed financially to do that, that the bonds are significant, that everything's in place for those jobs to go on in future. Yeah. So, I think, we're doing a bad job, an appallingly bad job at the political level with that sort of thing at the moment. What people up there hear, is from every politician, if you haven't got coal, you've got nothing. And that is just so untrue.
But it's so interesting, because you hear this, about the economy objections all the way through. But, Ketan, you mentioned the term climate stimulus. Why, well, first of all, what is this? And why aren't we hearing more about that as a smackdown to but the economy?
We're going to have the gas-fired recovery, This is what's going to happen, of course.
I don't think that's a climate stimulus.
I was just speaking to Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, until very recently. And I asked him outright, do we need more gas to make the transition? He said, I don't think so. No. So, it's not, this is just rubbish that's coming out of the mouths of our political masters. They have insufficient fear of the electorate. Yes. And that's the problem.
And for somebody like Alan Finkel, who, as both Ketan and Tim would know, is not exactly an extreme environmentalist.
No, he's not.
Or Tony Wood from the Grattan Institute, who has said coal is dead in Australia, and if there has to be any investment in gas, it should be an investment that is hydrogen, renewable hydrogen ready. You've got some of them quite sober engineers and economists saying this is absolutely within our reach. So the challenge is not necessarily an industrial and technological one, although both of them would say that there are significant challenges. The problem is a political one.
So this notion of climate stimulus then, Ketan, what is that? We're so used to hearing this negative story. What is climate stimulus?
So the word kind of changes as you look at different parts of the world, but you can basically summarize it as economic recovery cash that's directed towards low or zero carbon things, right? So not just technologies, but there's this sort of wide array of things that you can spend money on that, first of all, provide a huge number of jobs. Secondly, they actually provide a huge boost to economies. And thirdly, of course, they actually become a part of this decarbonization process. And so this is so important because, as Tim and Rebecca would know quite well, where we are with emissions is actually a really, really sensitive moment in the world. It's sort of like this fork in the road, right? When it comes to whether the economic recovery from COVID-19 is dirty or clean. And so when it comes down to the actual details, this includes things like people would already know, like installing solar panels on rooftops, getting jobs installing renewable energy, or like Tim mentioned, doing things like remediation of fossil fuel infrastructure. Of mine sites. We don't want to remediate fossil fuels. We want the opposite. And so, but there's also a lot of other things as well. It's not just a technological thing. There's also there's so many different things you can do in terms of energy efficiency. There's a lot of different jobs around transport. Bus drivers are heroes of climate action. There's just so many different things and so many different sectors that people are going to need to dedicate their time to. And just to bring it back to what Rebecca said earlier about the anxiety that particularly young people are feeling. A really good way to offer people a way out of that is to give them something to do. And what we actually know for sure is that when you do this, it has an actual impact. It makes a really serious dent not just in emissions, but also trying to like dislodge fossil fuels from being locked in. So this climate stimulus, I guess you could call it, is super, super important.
Yeah, and just to Ketan's point about climate stimulus, I did most of last year for me was researching Australians' attitudes to whether we could combine COVID recovery with climate action. And in the middle of last year, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, they do a survey every year of 1,800 company directors. And in the middle of COVID, they asked them, what is the biggest thing that keeps you up at night? They said climate change in terms of risk and in terms of the future. In all of the research I did last year, when I put to really diverse audiences, do you think that we can recover from COVID and still continue to invest in renewable energy? They said absolutely. So again, the only laggards here, the only people, and then of course we've got a federal government who thinks their response should be a gas-led recovery. Now that's not necessarily coming from the electorate. In fact, it isn't. It isn't even coming from the business community, which on many other issues they listen to. So it is absolutely kind of trenchant ideology on this question. And it's really enormously frustrating.
Which is interesting because, Tim, I mean, you know, I imagine everybody in this room watching rant and rail about politics a lot. But I mean, from your book, it does seem that a lot of the vitriol should be reserved for federal politics because state and local governments, and you give quite a few examples, are actually really stepping up. So do you think that if Australia, or let's say when, because we're being optimistic and hopeful, when Australia does achieve required emissions reductions, will this be despite the federal government rather than because of it?
Look, at the moment, yes, absolutely. Look at, you know, it doesn't matter at the state level whether it's a Liberal or a Labor government in place. They're all backing renewable energy to the hilt. Tasmania, a Liberal government, wants 200% renewable. You know, the Liberals in South Australia have built on the heritage they got from Labor in terms of clean energy generation and just going gangbusters with doubling big batteries and doing all this sort of stuff. You know, in New South Wales, right here in this state, we've got Matt Kean. You know, there's no one better at leading the climate response, in my view, than Matt Kean. And yet at the federal level, what have we got? An energy minister saying, oh no, we need the gas-fired recovery. It's all going to be about gas. And the COVID team he put together with Andrew Liveris and people like that. I mean, my godfather, what an abomination, you know, what an abomination, a political ideology gone mad. Yeah. So there's all of that. And then where's the, you know, we're talking about electric vehicles in Norway. Where is our policy for electric vehicle uptake in Australia? The electric vehicle, I wouldn't even call it a policy that was produced by the federal government a few weeks ago, will just set us back. Yeah. It offers nothing. There's no reform of fringe benefit tax. There's no reform of the luxury goods tax. Nothing. We're given nothing.
Yeah.
So, and they'll be negotiating on our behalf in Glasgow. You know, they're the people who'll be doing it. So there's 25 people, in my view, in that federal parliament who need to go. You know, we've got, you know, and that's the biggest contribution that this generation can make.
That's the most conservative thing you'll say this evening.
Yeah. Well,
there's more on my hit list.
Sorry, I don't want to.
I did actually mention about how we achieve change without resorting to the guillotine. So
yeah, well,
we can go there.
But do you know what we do? And I think that in so many ways, for whatever the nature of modern politics means, that politicians are often the last to move, which is frustrating. But there has been extraordinary movement over the last couple of years. And to tell you the truth, when you look at the two major parties, there are blockages. It's not complete. It's not absolutely, you know, it's worse on the Conservative side than it is on the Labor side. I mean, I see this as a kind of the electoral transition pain, you know, transition pains through the electoral system. And also you do have to, I mean, one of the things that's so extraordinary about Matt Kean, and I do worry about him, when he first started speaking so eloquently about climate, I had that feeling, remember that show called Funniest Home Videos, you know, when somebody would be doing something and with his kid and you thought you're going to get hit in the nuts any moment. It's going to happen. It's just when. And he has not been smacked in the nuts yet. He's still got them. And so it actually shows, I actually thought, what's going to happen? Somebody's going to threaten your pre-selection apparently. And so I think that there have been some acts of leadership and bravery. You've got some really fantastic, eloquent independents in the parliament, including somebody like Helen Haynes, who's got a fantastic local power plan for Australia, kind of building on what Ketan says. So there is possibility. We just can't lose hope that our vote is still an incredibly effective way to send a message on climate. And what the research shows is that people are increasingly seeing that as a kind of a blunt instrument, potentially because they voted for a couple of prime ministers with climate in the mix, and those prime ministers have got shot in the head. So it is, I understand why there's that cynicism, but we do need to persevere, and we do need to ensure that our faith in our democratic system as a way to express some of the anxiety we have about where we're going, that we still need to build that faith.
Yeah, now, look, could I just say, it's not just about your vote, it's about getting involved. You know, and it's so much easier than people think to get involved. You know, just set up a meeting with your local member, talk to them about climate change. If they're not delivering what you want, you've got to tell them straight out, I can't work for you, I'm going to be working against you in this. Unless you can deliver what we want, I'll be working against you.
Yes.
And then you might have to put up an independent. People have done it before. I mean, I got involved with Zali Steggall's campaign, you know, from a very early stage. And that was a great success. You know, we can all do more in the political arena, and we need to.
And I mean, it's interesting seeing this rise of independent candidates, and you know, are we on the cusp of this kind of paradigm shift in Australian politics, where you know the kind of, you know, this two-party structure is being challenged by people like Zali Steggall based on climate?
Can you imagine if at the last election we'd got 3 Zali Steggalls up? Just imagine 3 independents. We'd be a minority Liberal government dependent upon, you know, very climate aware independents. We'd be living in a different world. As it was, we got 1 up. You know, I hope at the next election we get more, but we shall see.
Yeah. So we're talking about politics and getting engaged. And Ketan, you talk a lot about community involvement and engagement. And you write that Australians don't simply want to be a passenger in the transformation to renewable energy. We want to be directly involved. Setting aside politics, how do we get involved? How do we be part of that transformation as individuals, as consumers?
Yeah, so that section of my book was like this internal struggle for me, because I had always sort of had this idea of like the personal carbon footprint and personal action was something of a trend that was exploited by the fossil fuel industry to sort of displace blame. And that is true, but it's also true that individuals have way, way more power than we've been led to believe, right? So this isn't stuff that relates to small scale individual like daily choices, right? So, I mean, of course you can do those things. You can walk to the shops, you can use your Keep Cup and reduce the plastic consumption, all that sort of stuff. But you can also become a participant as part of your lifestyle in systemic change. So it's sort of a spectrum, right? So an example would be looking at where your superannuation money is and saying, is it with someone that is using that money to be lent to fossil fuel projects? And then if it is, taking that money out and then emailing that company and saying, I really didn't like that you were using my cash to lend to fossil fuel projects. And that has a massive, massive impact. And so more broadly, this is known as the divestment movement, right? Which is where people look at their money, whether it's in a bank or a superannuation fund, and say, I really don't want to have anything to do with anyone who is doing massive fossil fuel things with their money. And unfortunately, there are a lot of banks around the world using money, even though they sort of have climate plans and, you know, they'll put out climate ambitions and things like that. They're still, unfortunately, lending quite a lot of money to fossil fuel projects. There was a great report a couple of weeks ago that just came out about this. And Australia's Big Four feature pretty heavily, ANZ being the one with the highest, you know, dollar amount being lent to fossil fuel projects. But the other 3 still, you know, they're still lending to oil and gas, not so much coal these days. So I kind of use that example because it's not something that requires you to like stress out too much. You don't need to kind of like create this change in your life that sort of stretches out into weeks and months. It's just something that you do. You log onto a website and you go, okay, well, they're not good. These people are good. You know, click transfer your money, right? Like it's a really, really powerful thing to do that doesn't require, you know, a huge amount of personal effort or investment. So it's really something. And when people do it, people like to do it together, right? So people will post about it on social media. You know, they'll go, "Oh yeah, I did that too. Oh my god, that's amazing." You know, like it feels so different to be part of a group of people doing the same thing as opposed to kind of just doing it yourself. In Australia, for instance, we've seen that happening with the solar industry, like people who install rooftop solar. There tends to be this sort of viral effect where people around them, notice that there's solar on that rooftop and they like to do it too. So doing it together is actually a really important part of doing it by yourself, right? They sort of go together. And then what we see is that when you add it all up, people kind of become greater than the sum of their parts. And it has a really serious impact. The divestment movement in particular, there was just some amazing numbers coming out over the past few months on decisions being made by these people who for so long have made exactly the wrong decision, starting to move slowly, not fast enough, but starting to move in exactly the right direction. So I think it's really important that people understand that when they do this sort of thing, it's not the same as like, riding a bicycle instead of driving a car. It's actually a force multiplier. And it's having this impact that's sort of way beyond your physical self, like your personal sphere. It's having this really serious impact on dislodging the baked in nature of the fossil fuel industry.
Just to build on Ketan's point, that moment when I kind of got up from the couch after having looked at the children, the strikers, the first thing I did is go to my computer and I changed my superannuation. And I told my ex-husband, you've got to do it or I'm not cooking dinner. Or other things for you. So that's one way to lobby people. But I knew it was important. I knew it was really powerful and I told a lot of people about it. And once I worked out what my password is, which took a long time. Yeah, right. So we always forget what our password is. 1 minute. Yeah. And I know enough that when that superannuation, when I access that in however many years, will have made the transition. Financially, I'm not going to be worse off for having done that. And since that moment, I've been doing quite a lot of work for the superannuation industry that are looking at this issue. I've been doing research with young people in particular. And they see it as once they get an understanding of it, how easy it is, how quick it is, they see it as a way to send a message through the system that funds fossil fuels to say, this is not on. Yeah. And it almost seems like when your vote doesn't seem to matter, when your vote on this issue isn't being heard, it can be powerful. So I think when we start to tell those stories and educate people, it's shorter than doing a quiz on Facebook, and probably less likely to be corrupted by Russian hackers. So it's a really, really good use of your time.
It's interesting that your book is titled "How to Talk About Climate Change," and you said in a way that makes a difference. And I thought it should be titled "How to Talk About Climate Change Without Having a Stroke." Why? I mean, it suggests that you want readers to talk to other people, and what Ketan is saying, is that we do need to have this collective action. How do we change the more stubborn hearts and minds around us? And I ask this because you have a list in your book, which is incredibly helpful, and I love that it ends in love. Yeah. But with your expertise, what do you see as being the most powerful ways that we can convince those around us to inspire them to action?
So it goes back to a point that Ketan made, which is that, there are so many ways to illustrate the immediate and direct value of climate action, which isn't about measuring emissions somewhere else. And once you start to connect those immediate benefits with the lives of people today, and you have to do a bit of listening and you have to tailor the message, then it can work incredibly effectively. We need to keep remembering that all the research shows that only about 9% of the population are unreachable on climate action. Right? Only about 9% of the population are dismissive, or what we would call deniers. Now, a lot of them are Tony Abbott and friends of Tony Abbott. I mean, that group is only problematic if they're in positions of power. Yeah. And they need to be, to use a horrible term, deplatformed. But other than that group you do not have to spend time worrying about that group. What you have to worry about is all the other groups of people in this country that generally believe the science, trust the CSIRO, don't think it's a left-wing propaganda outfit, but say, I am worried about this. how can I connect it to my life? How can you give me pathways to be active, and how can you give me hope, and how can you demonstrate the value of this? And so it is a communication challenge for different audiences, and we can move and reach 90% of the population. We haven't got much time to do it, but we've got the tools.
Which is interesting. Actually, I'll just cut quickly to a question that we received from the audience from Susan Crick, the Blue Mountains Conservation Society, and she talks about the psychology of denial, and that, you know, yes, we have the 9% who openly deny climate change. We're not going to dignify them by calling them skeptics, but many deny it by doing nothing. And so, how do we dig people out of that apathy?
Yeah, I mean, Leslie Hughes just did a really interesting piece saying that, you know, that lack of action is a new form of denial. So, you know, it's not quite the de rigueur anymore to deny climate change, except if you're Malcolm Roberts. But it's this, oh, I believe in it, it's important, but there are other issues. So this kind of stalling technique is a new form of denial, and we've got to find ways to attack that. And there's a lot of people in the federal government that do that. Look, the challenge is really for all parts of civil society to provide avenues, different kinds of avenues for people. So I kind of understand that. I mean, I do a lot of audience research. And I do something called a segmentation of the Australian community called Climate Compass. And there is one of the segments of that in that segmentation. It's a small percentage, but it's people we call the disengaged. They're disengaged from politics. They're disengaged from climate change. And when you look at the demographics of that group, it's only 6% of the population. 70% of them are women on low incomes with huge amounts of caring responsibilities. So I don't blame them for being disengaged. They're just trying to find their kids' socks. I mean, honestly, we're asking them to really solve climate change when the people whose job it is to solve it aren't doing anything. So it's our job, the big corporations in this country, all levels of government, any organisation with any kind of power or influence, to create opportunities for all of us to be able to play a role. This continuing trying to say that individuals are going to, and Ketan's right, we can scale up individual action, but we need to provide multiple pathways for action.
Tim, did you
in the book I describe it as the most important lifestyle change is for the CEO of the fossil fuel company to change his lifestyle from worsening climate change to not worsening climate change.
That's right.
That's an important behavioural change.
Yes, that's a good one.
No, I was just going to say, I wouldn't give up on anyone, even the 9%.
Oh, you're very.
But I believe I'm a strong believer in deplatforming. Yes, but I you know, I was out at Young, you know, this little town about 3 or 4 months ago. Went out there at the invitation of a very enlightened farmer, and so we took a few museum people out with us and ended up brokering a meeting between the mayor and some councillors and some enlightened farmers and the CEO of the local Indigenous the land council and so forth. And it was amazing. So we had perhaps 100 people in the hall, which was good given the COVID situation. And I realised the mayor he's an ex-shearer, right? And he was a bit intimidated, I think, by having some intellectuals come to town. And he had a couple of older blokes, 70-year-old, dressed in a suit and tie, And so we thought, I'll give them the floor first. So I asked them to speak. And I got a great diatribe about how climate change is just rubbish and all this sort of stuff from one of them, And at the end of it, I just said, look, thank you for coming along. It's been really great to see you. We respect, the fact that you're here. I have to disagree with you about climate change and so forth. But anyway, the bloke came up to me after the meeting and at morning tea. And I just started talking to him. And I said, what do you do in town? He said, I'm in a band. I said, what do you play? He said, a piano accordion. And I said, well, you wouldn't believe it. I had my first piano accordion lesson last week. Absolutely true. But from that moment, he was like, oh, fellow piano accordionist, we were bonded. And after the morning tea, he must have had a word to the mayor because we got an invite to come back. They said they joined the city's power partnership. It was just an amazing thing. So don't give up.
Music is
it's
pushing through.
Music is the food of climate change action.
But it's a really good example, which is that if you got into an argy-bargy with him and called him, that kind of the Twitter sphere kind of. I mean, in the end, it's about trying to listen, empathise, and have that ongoing conversation. And you know, in that, he may not have dramatically changed his view about climate change, but he could see the value of a power partnership.
That's right.
And he could see that you were listening to him and you weren't shutting him down and saying he was stupid or a crazy person or all the rest of it.
And we could let him be a bit of a hero in the local community. All those people watching saw him do a bit of leadership.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Tim, in your book, you talk about there's a shift in the mentality of global climate. We're kind of going from the micro to the macro now. That in global climate negotiations, from the I win, you lose mentality to win-win. I mean, what changed and why, and what effect is this likely to have at the next meeting?
Well, look, it was Christiana Figueres who said that, as she was she's the head of the climate negotiations for the UN, but for years she worked in a situation where renewables were more expensive than fossil fuels. So whenever you were negotiating, you were asking people to give something up, and that was incredibly difficult. But just over the last few years, the cost of clean energy has fallen below that of fossil fuels. So as she puts it now, for most countries, there's a real win-win, unless you're Saudi Arabia or somewhere else. And her view is that that's changed the tone of the negotiations. It's allowed people to be ambitious, to move forward in that win-win situation. And when I think about my life, the only times I've managed to change things is when there has been a win-win, like the old piano accordionist. He got a win, I got a win. It was kind of, the win-win is really important. It's very hard to operate in a world of win-lose. Yeah. So I think that in terms of the situation now globally with the negotiations, most countries are in a better position. There's still going to be a rump. There'll be Saudi Arabia, Russia, probably Australia, unless we have a change of government. There'll be a group trying to hold back progress because they see their future in fossil fuels. But beyond that, it's a win-win.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think that's going to drive change really rapidly. It's going to gallop ahead. The past is not going to be like the future. But I suppose one of the things I've thought about, and the wisdom and leadership of First Nations people is really critical here. In all of this excitement about what has been happening in the last couple of years and will happen, I still reflect on what has been lost and how we need to continue to reflect on what's been lost. And I, remember snorkeling the Great Barrier Reef with my eldest, who's 13 now, and she was about 5. And I thought, she's not really going to, this is not going to be the same experience that she might have with her children. So we do have to find ways, I think, and this, like I said, the wisdom and leadership of First Nations people is really critical here, not just in terms of their stewardship of our land, but also of their understanding of what it is to remain resilient and strong and keep the bonds between us strong when we've lost so much, when we still have trauma. And as Tim has said, having seen Tim speak a lot of times, there's still a lot of CO2, there's still a lot of warming baked into the system. I don't mean to be a downer. And I think that we can deal with the loss. And I think there are ways that we can do it, and we can build a society where we support each other through that loss. But the loss of the loss that is coming down the pipeline at us will need to be addressed, and it will require a different kind of leadership, not a smug, complacent, I don't hold the hose, I don't hold the syringe, I don't know what he holds. I don't know what he's holding. I don't want to think what he is holding. He's not holding anything. All right, so it's not going to require those kinds of, it's going to require quite courageous, tough leadership, or the pitchforks are going to be out.
It's interesting because you devote a whole chapter to despair in your book, and I personally found it very difficult to read. And each of you in your books have moments of despair. I think Ketan's, yours is the most colourful because I think you were sitting on a park bench dressed as a zombie Kramer for Halloween, which I thought was quite an image. But how do we survive despair? How do we not succumb to it?
Alcohol.
Brought to you
not
by
alcohol.
Brewers.
No. Despair. You deal with despair by action, right? And weirdly, and it's always really interesting. This is the second event that I've done with Tim, and you are you are, you've been in this fight for a really long time, and I'm a Johnny come lately. I've just come into the room. It's like, wow, what can I do? So I know that you've written and talked about your kind of, the despair that you've gone through in different parts of your life on this question. So I think that for me, coming into the environment movement, I thought I would feel more despair. I was thinking, okay, I've got to get my therapist. I've got to get ready for all this despair. And it does come when you look at the science and when you look at stuff, but also extraordinary things happen. And you meet people who are sometimes doing quite small things in difficult circumstances, and here in Australia and around the world, and that makes you think that actually stops the despair.
It's interesting you say that, because I think my lowest moment of despair was to go and take a climate sign and stand on the Great Western Highway for an hour in the middle of the day saying climate action now, and all the truckers going past, honking their horns. But I think it was the ratio of pros to cons was about 1 to 4. So it worked out. But yes, that was an interesting action.
Have any of you read Jonica Newby's latest book?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Which I think is wonderful. But what it pointed out to me was, I think there's a sex difference in some of the way people approach. She talks about this a little bit, that women seem to feel more prone to that despair, whereas men, I know in my own life, I've just become incredibly battle hardened. I'm used to losing. And I know I'm going to lose.
Women are also used to losing. I actually disagree with you.
You disagree with Jonica with that?
No, I think I think in my experience, there's tons of men sitting around going, "Oh, isn't it terrible?" And there's women going, "I'm going to do the dishes, and then I'm going to go into a petition online." I think it's a character personality thing. I've got to say.
So, Ketan, because you have a very young child. I mean, that's probably, I've seen this with friends who are science journalists who've had kids, that suddenly brings a whole new dimension into this discussion. How have you managed, have your despair, I guess, in that?
Yeah, of course. So as was in the Climate Council report that actually came out today, there is some proportion of climate change that is locked in from the historical emissions that have already happened. And there's two elements to this in my mind. The first one is basically how do you deal with those physical changes in the real world? How do you deal with the geopolitical things that are going to happen? And I think about the future of my kid, and it sounds a little vengeful, but I want her to know who did this, right? And I want her to know why it happened. So those two bits of information can feed into the reality that's going to unfold over the next couple of decades, right? And the reason I focus on those things is because they're actually really key to avoiding this continuing to happen. So when we look at, so with the Black Summer bushfires, for instance, what we saw is that there was this discourse around blame, right? So the government was saying, we didn't do this. Like, how can you say that our policies have caused these bushfires? That's ridiculous. And of course, like these disasters are not going to happen due to the individual policies of particular governments, but there are people who have been massive global players in, stifling action for decades who are still in power. And if they're not still in power, we know their names, we know what they did, and we have to understand the way that they worked. And I think that trying to focus on some of these things is actually really important. First of all, because it's empowering in that you actually have the capability to stop this happening in the future. But also it's historical, right? Like this is information, like the stock of emissions in the atmosphere and the oceans at the moment came from people making particular decisions. And so I know that that's not a particularly, it may not be the healthiest way to deal with grief and despair, but to me, it's a little bit trying to convert despair, or at least channel some of that despair into a fighting spirit, because we know that this is avoidable, and we know that worsening the problem is an option, right? Like we know we don't have to continue making things worse. So if we understand why it went wrong in the past, I think it'll enable people, not just us, but like people who are born today, people who will be born in the future, to go, look, these generations, they really messed up. They let this through the keeper, and we can avoid it by really knowing exactly what to look out for. The shift from climate denial into delay, attempts to delay action, is a particular focus at the moment. And I think this is going to be actually really important to make into an educational thing, to kind of say to young people, look, this is what you need to look out for in a company doing like a net zero target, because, you know, it may be good, it may not be good. So this is really the first place that my mind goes, is vengeance and education.
Wow.
That's a great mix. I like it, because it's interesting with your book, Rebecca. I mean, you do go through all of these emotions, and I get it sounds like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for the climate era.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, what was the emotional journey like for you writing that and exploring each of those, you know, grief and anger and despair?
It was pretty bad, and it was because even though I'd done a year of research on the book, I only had 5 weeks to write it with no air conditioning during the fires. So, so it took a lot out of me. But I suppose the most interesting insight into it is going into it, I thought, well, I'm going to kind of deal with negative emotions like fear and guilt and loss and all those things in there, and I'm going to come to a realization that those aren't good emotions when it comes to communicating climate change. And that's not entirely right. You know, righteous anger, flashes of righteous anger are pretty important. It gets people on the streets. It gets people, you know, like Zali Steggall saying, I'm going to run for parliament. It gets a whole lot of people doing things. Consistently, constantly being angry turns people off. Guilt is important if it connects people to responsibility, if you feel a sense of responsibility coming out of that. But shaming people, saying you should be ashamed because you're a coal miner, well, maybe you're just a coal miner because that's the job that you have done all your life and your dad did, and you know, there's no point in making you feel bad about that as a human being. It's
interesting actually you talk about guilt and shame, because I found that really interesting, the difference between those and the implications that difference has in terms of inspiring people to action.
No, that's right. So I actually think that there can be lots of effective so-called negative emotions engaged in climate communications, but I thought I was going to end with hope. But in some ways, hope is like delay. Hoping something's going to happen. Elon Musk is going to kind of, you know, descend from the heavens and, you know, do something to kind of fix it all is a different kind of denial. I ended with what I kind of called cheesily love. Like, I'm not very romantic, but what I think I ended with is this idea of the mobilizing force of caring for something, whether it's your kids, whether it's a natural environment that you've always loved, whether it's the koala, whether it's your business, whether it's I want my business to get cheap energy and, you know, and do better. The mobilizing force of care, connecting the thing that you care and love with climate change and climate action, realizing that runaway climate change threatens the things you love, and acting on climate change protects it. It sounds very simple, but it's a formula that I think works extremely well when you come to communicating climate.
Because that's something also that stood out for me. You talked about this notion of objects of care, of things that we love. And you talked about the Audubon Society in the US, which is this birds society that was founded by a chap who loved birds. And that in terms of kind of engaging with members of that society on climate change, it began, or the kind of the fruitful discussions came from when you started talking about the birds that people loved and what might happen with those birds. So one thing I wanted to ask all of you is, you know, this objects of care for you, and I guess we can assume that children are, you know, fairly fundamental to that. So we'll just leave those aside as a given, but we hope. But I mean, what objects of care are the things that, you know, that spur you to action, Tim?
Well, can I just unpack that a bit, because it's kind of complex. So I was Australian of the Year in 2007, right? And since then I've been involved with, even before that, with climate change, but in a bigger way since. And since then, humanity has emitted 30% of all of the greenhouse gases it's ever emitted in its entire history.
Oh my gosh.
So we are on a bad trajectory, a very bad trajectory. And things are going to rapidly get worse unless we can do something in the next few years, right? So I tend not to think about that objects of care stuff. I am in the middle of a very serious battle. And as has been said, you know, evil is incredibly banal. It's unbelievably banal. It's almost, you can't really hate it because it's so small-minded and so petty. So I find I've just got to keep on pushing. I know that we're going to, the barrier reef, Great Barrier Reef that I swam on as well, it's not going to be there. We know that. That's when they say that's on the balance of probabilities, right? If we get incredibly lucky, maybe we'll save it, but I'm bracing myself for a future where it's not going to be there. But I do want to save my civilization. I do want to make sure my society can survive, and that demands urgent action now. Right? It's not something where we can think, oh, I'll do something in 2025. No, it is this year, next year, and the year after that are incredibly important.
Just to build on Tim's point, for me, my thing that I would like to protect is, at the moment, by and large, when Australian society goes through a crisis, some of us scrabble for toilet paper, but most of us don't. Most of us reach out to neighbours and care for people. The more stress that climate change puts on our society, the less likely that is to happen. So the thing that I care for is the fact that we still largely care for each other. And I would hate to see that go.
Yeah. What about you, Ketan?
It's I have to copy Tim and Rebecca's points, but make it even more sort of overarching, in that this really just seems to be a very simple question of, is humanity capable of extracting itself from this particular type of problem, right? Oh, can we actually do this? And I suspect so. I actually really, I feel like the difficulty has been, we've just been like constantly hit by this drumbeat of failures for so long that we're actually starting to, myself very much included, lose a little bit of perspective on what we can do. So I want that to be proven right. I want humanity to be able to, when it recognizes that it's on a bad trajectory, to be able to avoid it. Because if that's not true, if that's something that we just physically as a people, as a community, as a species can't do, then even if we manage to scrabble our way out of this particular problem, then it puts us on a bad trajectory for the next problem that comes along, right? Like, so, and perhaps we just need to learn how to do it now. Perhaps we need to figure it out, but I think we can.
Because it's interesting, Tim, your book talks about, COVID. This is in a COVID world. Has COVID and how we've responded to it, I guess, and obviously some countries haven't responded quite as well. Has that given you much hope that we are capable of such drastic action as a society?
Look, it's given me enormous hope, particularly for Australia, because the federal government acted on the basis of good science and acted absolutely decisively, regardless of cost to the economy. So, and we did three things. The first thing we did, do you remember back in February last year? I mean, I met the chief medical officer back on January 26th that year and was talking about the issue. And, he'd recommended within a few weeks that cutting off flights from China, from Wuhan, remember that, was a big economic impact. So then on March 13, the Prime Minister actually announced the hard lockdown. The fact we were going to, because the chief medical officer had said to him, if you don't act now, when you're not going to be able to act in future, there'll be so many cases it'll be run away. Now, at that point, I didn't know anyone who had COVID. I think extremely few people did. We didn't know how dangerous the disease was. Maybe 1 in 100 people, killed. But it was a theoretical problem, just like climate change is now, right? And the government acted on it. And so the equivalent in climate action is to stop the problem growing. That's what you've got to do. Stop the transmission, stop the burning of fossil fuels. So we get onto that, and almost regardless of cost, you do that, And then the next thing the government had to do was deal with the casualties. There was already a lot of people who were sick. We had to make sure we had enough casualty wards, enough medical staff, enough respirators, enough medical transport, and so forth. So in terms of climate, again, that means we've got to make sure we're giving the Great Barrier Reef the best chance to survive. It means that we've got to make sure our medical system's going to be good for future heat waves, that people who are affected by sea level rise are going to be adequately taken care of. There are endless things there to do in that casualty, that emergency zone, that we need to do and the government needs to focus on. Third, we need to search for a vaccine. And I remember when we started talking about a vaccine 15 months ago, the best people in the world were saying, look, I don't know whether we can do this. We may never succeed at getting a vaccine. But what I can tell you is it's going to be very expensive and it's going to take time. Right? And they're being proved true. So the vaccine in terms of climate is drawdown. It's getting the gas out of the air making sure that we can, even if we overshoot, we can get back down in adequate time. And that means it's doing what David Attenborough said in A Life on Earth, you know, taking care of our forests, repairing our oceans, looking after our soils. It means using direct air capture properly of CO2 and silicate rocks and seaweed and things like that that'll help us. So that three-phase approach should be the business of government, because we are very close to the edge now with this. And if we had a government that did what they did for COVID, for climate, I would be feeling much, much better about our future.
Yeah.
And you're just this week, the Prime Minister said we've got to get on a war footing to deal with the vaccine rollout.
Yeah.
Sure, we need a war footing for climate as well.
Yeah. Right. So there's one question that came through from the audience earlier, which talks about climate change as a symptom of overconsumption, overpopulation, and this focus on growth. And is there action to address those root causes? I mean, that's obviously a big question, but do you want to speak to that at all?
Look, I can do it just briefly. You know, clearly with nearly 8 billion people on the planet, you know, that's a part of the problem. You know, the difficulty that I've had with dealing with the population issue is really twofold. One, it's really difficult to ask anyone to get off. We don't want to be doing that, right? It's kind of, we're stuck with the population we got, and that's the reality. Secondly, we know how to slow the increase, and it's simply to increase the welfare, the economic welfare and the social welfare of women, the poorest women on our planet. We know how to do that. It's incredibly cheap to do. If we turned our foreign aid budget to doing that, we'd be doing a great thing. We wouldn't be solving the climate problem, but we'd be slowing that future growth. And so all of that's common sense. So if people talk to me about population, I say, well, write to the Foreign Minister and make sure that my tax money is spent taking care of the most vulnerable women on our planet. It's the best thing we can do for the environment. So, and growth as a whole, you know, we're going to have to grow to build 7 times more wind turbines than we've ever put in place in Australia, 7 times more solar panels. That's just for electricity. We're going to have to do that 3 times over to electrify the entire economy in Australia. So there's plenty of growth is going to have to happen to solve the problem. So I don't know. I just think we've got to look at it differently.
Yeah. So Rebecca, as a sociologist watching how things have changed, how we've responded and how humans have responded to COVID-19, has anything changed? Has that changed your thinking about how we might respond to climate change at all?
I think it's made me think, with a bit of leadership, consistent leadership, evidence-based leadership, it's extraordinary what you can get a community to do. And it shows you, as Tim said, that if you actually did that on, I mean, we do have to come to terms with the fact that COVID is different to climate, and that, but they're not completely different, you know. So there's a lot of lessons to be made in relation to that. And the thing that you know, to tell you the truth, when COVID happened, I was despondent for a whole range of reasons, but I thought the agenda around climate would stall, and that people would not want to think about it anymore. And that actually wasn't the case. And we saw some extraordinary things happen last year with business commitments to renewable energy and state governments doing various things, and the community largely supporting this. I was really worried that my biggest concern was that if there was going to be any slight change in emissions, which was only ever going to be a flash in the pan, let's face it, people would associate environmental kind of improvement with deprivation. They'd associate it with homeschooling their children, which is now, you know, and being locked up and not being able to go out. And that didn't happen either, you know. So I actually felt, I mean, there had to be some silver linings to last year, and that was one of it. But the other thing, and I think this is really important as well, and I would love somebody to do some economic modelling about this. What we need is a job keeper for the transition for fossil fuel workers. You know, people constantly say, oh, we've got to give these people jobs. And you say, you just propped up huge parts of the workforce because you knew that those people were were not going to be able to work. And a lot of those people left industries, stayed in industries, came back, or basically pivoted, did something different in the same industry. What we would have to do for fossil fuel workers in Australia, pales in comparison to what we did with JobKeeper.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we can do it through a pandemic, we can do it for those communities.
Yeah.
It's about, you know, as Tim would know, about 10,000 people directly employed in fossil fuels in Australia, mainly in coal. And those jobs are getting smaller. And I would also say that, having done an enormous amount of research in Northern Queensland and the Hunter Valley, while those communities are resentful of environmentalists, they also know that there are not going to be more jobs in the future. They know, because they've seen what's happened in the past. At some level, they know that they're being sold a bit of a lie, but something is better than nothing. They do have to have trust that the transition plan in front of them is a real one, that politicians will deliver it, and that it will deliver prosperity and happiness for their community. And that is the rub. That's the problem.
What about you, Ketan? Are you more optimistic after seeing, I actually don't know what the response has been like to COVID and where you are, but has it changed your feeling about future responses?
Yeah, it's actually a really surprisingly complicated question, because you know, the responses to COVID have been really mixed in very different parts of the world. Obviously, all of this ties into like the sort of cultural issues in countries and political issues. The UK has had some of the worst outbreaks in the world of COVID-19, but they're also seeing one of the fastest vaccination rates in the world as well. Australia has had a really good response to the actual outbreaks, but is not doing particularly well on a global stage in terms of vaccination. And Norway's kind of just in the middle, as it almost always is. So it's hard to have any really clear takeaways beyond, it just sort of confirms what we already really knew, which is that you can't just rely on the technology. You need to start thinking about other different, you need to start thinking about different like social and political alternatives instead. I also just want to quickly mention, in response to that question about growth, because it sort of ties in with the COVID-19 thing. There's this really interesting movement around the world called degrowth, right? And this is there's some really interesting academic work coming out relating to this, which is basically, how do you stop growth from becoming the central point of conversation about climate, right? So often when it sort of culturally dominates, you get a lot of people such as myself, you know, who work in climate, sort of saying, look, you know, we can actually we can resolve the climate question without having to impact economic growth. And you'll sort of see like models of GDP and things like that. But this sort of movement says, well, look, you know, you don't really you can actually focus on human welfare and human well-being without having to focus too heavily on the growth question. Of course, there's the pushback, which is basically that's going to scare people, like that people are going to think, oh, actually, are you saying that I have to sort of sacrifice my quality of life? And so that debate is sort of playing out around the world, and it's worth having a read of it. I recommend, there's a really great book called Donut Economics by an economist called called Kate Raworth. And it sort of proposes, like, you know, there are people who live in awful conditions in the world who need to be helped out of those conditions, but also at the same time you can trim the excesses of overconsumption in countries as well, and try and meet somewhere in the middle in a sustainable way.
Fantastic. We've actually gone a few minutes over time, which I think is problematic when you're doing a live stream. So if you could please join me in thanking Ketan Joshi, Tim Flannery and Rebecca Huntley for their excellent advice. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, and thank you, everybody, for listening. And one last thank you to our wonderful panelists, Bianca Nogrady, Rebecca Huntley, Tim Flannery, and Ketan Joshi. Thank you. And safe travels back home, and hope to see you all back here for our Blue Mountains Writers Festival, October 21st to 24th. And thank you also, Chris Tobin, for your wonderful welcome to country. Oh, and the books, books are available for purchase, and the authors will be there for signing straight after this event. And if you're listening online, you can follow the links from our website to purchase the books. All right, thank you, everybody.